Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. I was a guest on someone else's podcast just yesterday, and a lot of his questions were about how to craft stories. So that word craft came up over and over. And as I was answering his questions, it occurred to me that that is not usually the problem that most people have. It's not as if they have a story that is a perfect real life example for the point they're trying to make, and they just don't know how to tell it well, or they don't know how to move the pieces around to make the story more compelling. That's not it. The biggest challenge most people have when it comes to storytelling is actually having the stories. Because if I give you the story, if I say, you're trying to make a point about innovation, and then I tell you the Airbnb story, you tell it a few times so it's stuck in your head, you'll be fine. You'll be able to tell the story without me giving you any direction of how to deliver it, or you're not going to have to change anything of the story. So it's finding the story that is the biggest problem. It's not the crafting or the telling of the story. So today, in this solo episode, I'm gonna try and put that one to bed, and I'm gonna tell you pretty much everything I know about how to always have the stories or find the stories when you need them, and then that excuse should no longer be part of your repertoire of excuses about why you're not telling more stories. And because I said repertoire, I probably best get on with it before this gets any worse. All right, let's do it. Last year, my oldest daughter, Alice, turned 4. And at the time, she was completely obsessed with the movie Frozen. So, what she wanted for her birthday was a frozen bicycle. And that's what she got. It was an ice blue bike with pink training wheels and stickers of all the characters of the movie covering the bicycle from back to front. But as soon as she started riding it, she started doing something a bit strange. Instead of her feet going round the pedals, they started going back and forth, back and forth. But, she was moving, she was enjoying herself, so I just let her. And a while later, I came to her and I said, "Listen, baby, there is an easier way to ride a bicycle. You go a bit faster, you get less tired. Would you like me to teach you?" And she said, "Yes, Daddy, could you please teach me?" And I tried, but it just didn't work. Right? Her brain had gotten so used to telling her feet to move in a certain way that no matter what I said to her, she just couldn't make that change. But she's only 4, so I told myself, when she's a bit older, it would be a lot easier to teach her how to do this properly. And that's what I believed until very recently when I heard about Destin Sandlin and the backwards bike. So, Destin Sandlin is an American engineer and a science communicator. He has a very popular YouTube channel called Smarter Every Day, which is up to almost 10 million subscribers. And about 2 or 3 years ago, one of his engineer friends challenged him to learn how to ride a backwards bike. So this was a bike where when you turn the handlebars right, the tires went left, and when you turn the handlebars left, the tires went right. And he thought, how hard can this be, really? And he got on top of the bicycle, started riding it, and as soon as he turned, he fell over. So he decided, okay, I'm gonna do this properly, and he decided to commit 5 minutes a day to learning how to ride this bicycle, and that took him 8 months. Right. So those two stories are how I opened a recent keynote I did, and that keynote was about how to story power change, how to gain support, overcome resistance, and create a lasting impact. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because until about a week before the keynote, I had absolutely no idea that I was going to use those stories. To be honest, I didn't even have them in my radar as stories. And I had to then use all the tools that I'm going to share with you now to actually find something that worked. And I'm going to tell you exactly how I found these stories. But first, I'm going to start breaking down a whole bunch of different ways that you can normally use to find stories. So, the first thing that it's important to realize is that finding stories when you need them is the hardest way to do it. The simplest, easiest way to do it, although it's arguably more work, is to collect stories. And that is definitely what I do. There are a lot of people who journal, and then naturally you might be writing down some stories when you do that. But I do a very specific type of journaling that I learned from Matthew Dix, who I had on this show. It was episode 59, I believe. It's called This Is Going to Change Your Life, which is a great episode, one of my favorites. I definitely recommend you listening to that one if you haven't yet. So the approach that I learned from him is called homework for life, and it's pretty straightforward. At some point of the day, usually near the end of the day, I ask myself this question: if I had to tell a story from something that happened today, something that I found out about today, what would that story be? Oh, also something that I remember today, because this happens a lot. So I asked myself those three questions, and it's very common that during the day something would have happened that I think could make a good story. Maybe I remember something from my past. Maybe I read something in a book. To be honest, I think reading something in a book might be a bit cheating, but I'm trying to just make sure that I always get stuff that is not, me and my children or me and my wife, which, because of COVID and how everything has become remote, a lot of my day to day has become recently. So I write down that idea. So not a story, just the idea. So if I had to tell a story from something that happened today, something I found out today, something I remember today, what would that story be? And I write it down, and I do that every single day. And because I've been doing that for a while, I think now I'm up to 200 and something ideas that could turn into stories. And not all of them can turn into stories, but plenty of them can. And the more you do this work, a few more than a few interesting things happen. So one of them is that you start remembering stories. So a lot of the stuff that I found myself telling a lot, including a big part of my origin story, have come to me while I was doing homework for life. The other thing that is very interesting is that you start paying more attention to your life. You are more present, you're more mindful, to use a fashionable term, because I might be talking to friends, and I start realizing this is something interesting is happening here. There's I'm happy, or I'm upset, or there's some very strange conversations going on, and what I'm doing is either not very normal, or actually is very very normal, and it's going to be relatable to a lot of people. So stuff like that comes into my mind, and I think, maybe this is it. This is homework for life for today. And at the end of the day, being more present, being more mindful, is, I don't think, is ever a bad thing. So there's a whole bunch of advantages to doing homework for life. But I fully recognize that a lot of people are not going to do that. They're not going to bother with doing something that they might think is very work intensive. But there are other ways of collecting stories. So, for example, if you're someone who listens to podcasts, then lots of podcasts are filled with stories. Hear anything interesting, just write it down. And that's probably a good moment for me to say that the way I write down my homework for life stories is, I have a spreadsheet, but because the spreadsheet's not the easiest thing to access from my phone, I also have just a note on my notes app on my iPhone. And then I just write the date, and I write the line or two that represents the story idea for the day. And if I'm when I'm bothered and I have some time to queue, I will move those stories from the note to the spreadsheet, because I think the spreadsheet's slightly better organized. I know a lot of people that use things like Evernote, but both on Notes or Evernote or a few other of these types of apps, you can even record the stories, in you can record them with your voice, like a voice note. That's what it's called in Moron, a voice note. So yeah, so you can just save a voice note instead of writing it down. Now, probably slightly harder to just read through quickly what you wrote down, but that's another option. And whichever way you're using it, you want to tag them somehow. So you want to just put hashtag change, hashtag conflict, whatever, just one word or two that it gives you the idea of what the story is about, because then you can just search for them. You can just do a search and find all the stories that you or story ideas that you wrote down that have that theme. So that's how I do it. So if you listen to podcasts all the time and you get any ideas, just stick them into your story notes or file or the Word document or whatever you're using. If you read business books, you'd be surprised once you pay attention that that's what they're doing. The vast majority of business books follows the same pattern, which is they will tell a story, and then from that story they're gonna broaden out the subject and the explanations, and they'll come back with give you data and statistics and all sorts of other stuff. But most business books, at least the good ones, are filled with stories, and you can definitely get a lot of stories that way. So those are the most typical ways that I collect stories. And if you just ask yourself on a regular enough basis, probably has to be every few days or every week, otherwise you're just not going to remember things. But have has anything happened that might make for a good story? Have you read anything? Have you heard anything? Have you watched a movie or a TV show that had any interesting stories that might serve as an example of something else? And then you write them down, and that's the collecting part of storytelling, and that's what I do. Fine. So I do this. I have hundreds of story ideas, and I have this keynote. It's about change, and I'm looking for a story to open it. So I went to my list, and I came back with squat. Like I couldn't find a single story that was very clearly about change and about the difficulty of change. Perhaps I didn't look hard enough, but I started looking for it. I looked for the stuff I had tagged, and I just didn't find something that I thought was going to work. So what I had to do is I had to do the more strategic type of work, which is actually finding the stories. So there's a number of different ways that you can do that. If you listen to the show regularly, you probably heard me talk about most of them, and they have I've learned them from previous guests in the vast majority of cases. And here are the approaches. So one of them is either the 4 F's or the 5 F's. I think what was his name? John Zimmer talked about the 4 F's, and Ryan Avery. Right, from his surname, I'm blanking on his surname, but one of my guests that was Ryan. I think it's Avery. He talked about 5 F's. So anyway, the 4 F's are firsts, fears, failures, and fiascos. Or fiasco being the more family friendly version of saying fuck ups, right? So those would be the 4 F's from John Zimmer. And Ryan Avery, I'm pretty sure now it's coming back to me, said 5 because he added family in there. So all you're thinking about is, okay, well, is there anything that the first time I did anything, is that an interesting story? What are my fears? What are my failures? What are my really big failures, my fiascos, my fuck ups? Is there anything with my family? Do I have any family stories? Now, that approach is helpful for some people. I think if you have some big for fears and failures, I think that's going to be very effective. I'm less convinced that that's going to be that good for things like firsts, because I think it's not directed enough. But for fears and failures and fiascos, that's going to bring up some interesting stories. Now, the other approach, and this one I do use a lot, is something that I now call first, last, worst, best. I originally heard about it from who was it, from Mark Brown, and he calls them, he changes the order of those words. Matthew Dix also uses that approach, and he changes the order too. But the idea here is there's this sort of a matrix that I usually give people in my workshops, or I've given to clients, right? So you have on the top written first, last, worst, best, and then on the left you have a whole bunch of nouns. So for example, kiss, car, trip, trouble, job, boss, teacher, injury, that you can add as many as you want there. You can have failure there. You can have pretty much any noun you can think of might be suitable for first, last, worst, best. And then what you're trying to do is you're completing that worksheet with all those things. What was your first car, what's your last car, your worst car, your best car. Now, you can't always complete every single one of them, like what's your best injury, unless maybe it's something that got you out of school for a long time or a job. But a lot of stories should come out of that, because if you write down that your worst car was this, I don't know, this Volkswagen Beetle. It's like, why was it the worst car? Like, what happened? What did that car do to you that makes you think of it as the worst car? And you're probably gonna have some stories of when you got stuck in the middle of nowhere because the car was crap and kept breaking down or something along those lines. Okay, so first, last, worst, best is a very interesting exercise, and you can keep adding nouns to it. Like, just if you've done the whole thing with the usual nouns, which is the ones I mentioned, just pick a whole bunch of different things. All right, just, project, friendship, you know, family member, relative, actually in that case. So just keep trying things, and you find a whole bunch of other stories. All right, then so that's another approach. Then the other thing you can do is just be very, very strategic about it. So let's say you're trying to talk to someone about your job, maybe about something you do or something you really care about. Then you can ask yourself the question, when did I start caring about this? What was the first time that I really realized that this was an important thing? And if you go back to the beginning, you're very commonly going to find kind of an origin story there. So the first time you ever realized that saving money and investing money and looking after your finances was important, what was that? In my case, it was probably how there were plenty of things in my childhood where we didn't have that much money, or at least not as much money as most of the kids that went to the fancy private school that I went to. So I often had to hear that we couldn't afford it, or it wasn't my birthday, Christmas, so there's no way I was going to get a present, and money didn't fall off trees, or this kind of silly things parents say. And I think that got into my head how money, like if I had more money I would be happier or something like that. And I can remember specific instances where that got imprinted in my head, like a crappy car that my mom couldn't afford to change, breaking down over and over on the road to the coast or something. Okay, so that's one example. Another one I can think of is maybe someone I know, like a relative who got into financial trouble, and because they never really saved any money or invested any money, and they ended up fighting with their siblings, her siblings in this case, because they had done better in life, and then it was kind of complicated to have holidays together because she was always counting pennies, and she felt proud to complain. Instead of complaining that or saying I don't have as much money as you, she just would like complain that everything was just overly expensive when it wasn't really. So you can think of things that were the first time that you realized that thing happened, maybe the last time that it happened to you, or sometime a time where it happened to someone else you knew, and you realize, wow, this is a problem a lot of people have. And if you go back to a lot of startup stories, that is usually what happens. A startup story is often about how the founders realized that there was a problem. They were suffering from that problem, and maybe other people would suffer from that problem, and that's what gave them the motivation to start trying to fix it. Okay, so when did you first realize this was a problem? Or when did you have to go through something like that in your life, and you screwed it up? Right, so if you're talking about the importance of communication, what was the worst experience you had with communication? Maybe it was a presentation that you completely bombed. Maybe was you're trying to talk to someone you cared about and you completely screwed that up. I mean, we all have examples of things like that. So the worst example of when that wasn't done properly by you or to you, those would be strategic ways to find those stories. So outside of the strategically asking yourself these questions, you can also do research. Okay, so this is as simple as going on Google or whatever browser search engine you use and just typing change stories, for example. If I'm looking for a story about change, if it's too broad, maybe it's going to take you too long to filter down through all the stories that are going to come up. But often you're going to find a page with 10 stories. You're going to find a few links that seem to be particularly interesting, and don't always need the best story. You just need a story that fits the purpose or the point you're trying to make. So in my case, I was looking for that. I actually Googled change stories, and I don't think I found anything that I immediately liked. I had a couple of candidates, and I toyed for a while with the idea of the what was it? I didn't want to do the Kodak story. Kodak didn't realize that digital photography was going to be a big thing, and they kind of screwed up a business that they were in an industry where they completely dominated. I thought that one was a bit done to death. The same with Blockbuster and Netflix. I toyed around with the idea of using the BlackBerry story. I thought that was a little more interesting because although everybody knows how BlackBerry essentially disappeared, even though they were the most popular phone for a very long time, I don't think that many people know the ins and outs of that story. So I found that one, I liked it. I actually rehearsed it a couple of times, but I wasn't really feeling it. And then I did the last thing that I occasionally do, which is go to trusted sources. So maybe there is a blog you like, maybe there's a podcast that always has good stories, maybe there is I don't know, maybe there's another storyteller out there that you respect and you listen to a lot of their stuff. So what I did is I went to one of the richest source of business stories that I know, which is the Anecdotally Speaking podcast. Now, if you listen to my show, you heard me talk about the guys from Anecdote plenty of times. I had one of them, Sean Callahan, on the show. I really, really like their approach to stories, and they're big believers in this idea of small stories, of finding small business stories and telling those. And they put very little focus in crafting stories or how you tell the stories. For them, it's just find a story that does the job, and that's essentially what you need to be doing. And their podcast is short. It's usually 15-20 minutes. One of them tells a business story. They score that story. They talk about why they think it's good or why it's not that good, when they would use a story like that, and that's about it. So because I was a bit backed up with episodes that I wanted to listen, I scrolled through the whole list of episodes, and I saved some of those that I thought might be interesting, and then oh, actually, I'm lying, that's not what I did. What I did was they had an episode of their favorite stories. So I listened to that one, and the other host of the show, Mark, he what's his surname? I'm having a massive issue with surnames today. But anyway, um, Mark, he mentioned that one of his favorite stories was the backwards bike story. So he told that, and at first I thought, yeah, I'm not sure, not sure. I mean, it was clearly a story about the difficulty of change, but I didn't love it. But then I went and did my own research, and I looked up the story. I found a few more things about who Destin Sandlin was, and what exactly the process he went through with telling the story. And as I did that, it occurred to me what had been going on with my daughter Alice. As I was going through the backwards bike story, I thought, hold on, my daughter is having a lot of trouble changing the way she rides a bicycle. And then I thought, okay, now I liked it because I could start with something very personal and kind of more amusing, I thought, than the Destin Sandlin thing. But then I could use that as a bridge to say, but she's a kid. When she's older, this will be easier. And then I have a story about Destin Sandlin, and see, it's not easy. And from that, I could pick out a more of like a scientific way of talking about change and why our brains struggle so much with it, and why our communication is the thing we're doing that is making, it's the wrong cog in the bicycle that's making our communication backwards, or work backwards. So so that's how I found that one. I tried my usual approaches, nothing was coming up. Then I did a bit of research. I went to my trusted sources, found one thing, did a bit more research. Then I went back to something that I had actually written down on Homework for Life, which was my daughter really struggling to learn how to ride a proper bicycle. And now and then I used that on the keynote. It worked really well. People really liked the story. It suited other parts of the keynote as well. Both parts, in both my kid and Destin Sandlin story, suited that, and that's when I found that story. So there you go. You can collect stories by doing something like Homework for Life or regular journaling. You can find stories, and listen to podcasts and read business books and write down stories as you find them. So that's the collection approach. And the strategic finding approach is doing things like the 4 or 5 F's: first, last, worst, best, to asking yourself very specific questions about: when did you realize this? When was the first time that you figured out this was important? When did you learn this? When did you or someone else get in trouble for not knowing this, for not knowing how to do this well? So those types of strategic questions. You can do research, just Googling for stories, and you can go back to your trusted sources. Okay, and with all of those things, I don't think I should ever have to listen to to the thing I hear so often from clients and from everyone else when it comes to stories, which is, but I don't have any stories, which always has to be said with a whiny voice. And you probably heard me say that before, because it's true. Okay, there you go. If you want any of this, if you want any of the resources that I mentioned here, I'm gonna put up a whole bunch of stuff on the show notes, or some stuff. I get lazy with that stuff, but just drop me a line, hit me up on LinkedIn, or drop me an email, at francisco@franciscomafuz.com, and I can send you the first, last, worst, best worksheet. I can send you the story journal that I often give to clients, and that's that, because this has just gone on for longer than I originally intended. So, all right, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time.